In January 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy became the 35th American president. At the age of 43, he was the youngest ever elected president of the United States. His New Frontier program included plans to extend economic benefits to all, increase federal aid to education, and provide health insurance for the elderly. He also made a serious attempt to tackle the problem of civil rights and to work for equality for black people. In 1961, he began a dramatic expansion of the US space program and committed the nation to the ambitious goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. His brief term of office, brutally terminated by his assassination in November 1963, was marked by significant geopolitical problems, including the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, and moments of great tension in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, played out on the nearby island of Cuba. In 1961, a group of Cuban exiles, supported and trained by the US, landed at the Bay of Pigs on the south coast of Cuba, hoping to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist regime. The attempted invasion was badly planned, and its failure led to anti-US demonstrations in South America and Europe, and to the criticism of President Kennedy. 1 year later, Kennedy faced another serious crisis. Cuba had installed Soviet nuclear missiles on the island, just 90 miles away from the American coast. Kennedy announced a naval blockade to stop Soviet ships reaching Cuba and threatened to use military force if necessary. For 13 days in October 1962, the world was on the brink of a nuclear war. Talks were held between President Kennedy and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev agreed to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade the island. Kennedy also secretly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. In the Second World War, black Americans fought bravely to defend the US, as did white Americans. But when they returned to the US, they discovered that nothing had changed at home. The US was not a land of opportunity for the blacks. Black people occupied the worst jobs in society, and segregation was still a reality in the southern states. Legal barriers at state and local levels prevented African Americans from exercising the right to vote. Voters were even asked to recite the Constitution before being allowed to vote. In 1957, Martin Luther King, 1929–68, founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, to fight for civil rights by peaceful marches and demonstrations, facing violence and arrests on a number of occasions. On the 28th of March 1965, following a 5-day voting march led by King from Selma, Alabama, to the Alabama state capital of Montgomery, peaceful participants were attacked by Alabama state troopers with sticks, whips, and tear gas. The brutal scene was broadcast on television and drew many more Americans and civil rights leaders to join the protest. President Lyndon Johnson called for federal legislation, and in August 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, guaranteeing voting rights for all black Americans. Despite frequent arrests and hostility, Martin Luther King continued to fight for equality and dignity for black Americans. He was assassinated in Memphis, Texas, in 1968. Already in the 50s and before the war in Vietnam, young people had started to protest over issues that touched on student freedom, university admissions, course requirements, and dress codes. In the cinema, James Dean was a global icon, embodying the rebel who defied authority and commonly accepted codes of behavior. Also in the 50s, there emerged a group of bohemian intellectual writers known as the Beat Generation, who rejected traditional conventions and opposed middle-class values. These were the precursors to the counterculture of the 60s, when thousands of American young people, shocked by the Vietnam War, racial injustice, and the materialism of a capitalist society, became the driving force behind the civil rights and anti-war movements.
1, 0, all engine running. Lift off on Apollo 11.
In the late 1950s, the Cold War between the US and the USSR found a new area of competition in the exploration of space. In October 1957, the USSR made the first step, launching the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik, which went into orbit around the Earth. The US launched its own satellite, Explorer-1, in 1958. In the same year, President Eisenhower created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, a federal agency dedicated to space exploration. Space exploration was a question of national prestige, but also had military objectives. Orbiting satellites would be used to gather intelligence on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union moved faster than the US, and in April 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit the Earth. The new president, John F. Kennedy, boldly announced that by the end of the decade, the US would land a man on the moon. On the 16th of July 1969, 3 American astronauts set off on the Apollo 11 space mission. Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and on the 20th of July, Neil Armstrong, 1930 to 2012, became the first man to walk on the moon. The industrial know-how that produced the weapons which helped win the war had direct peacetime applications. Space exploration research also contributed to development in electronics, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, aeronautics, energy, and other fields. During the 1950s, television became the dominant medium. Television broadcasts became the main source of news information and entertainment. The digital revolution, the change from analog to digital electronics, began in the latter half of the 20th century. Analogous to the Industrial Revolution, the digital revolution marked the beginning of a completely new era. Central to this revolution was the mass production of digital logic circuits and its derived technologies, the computer, the mobile phone, and the Internet, which marked the availability and proliferation of information at exponential rates. So much so that our age has been appropriately called the Information Age.